Hello world of YouTube and welcome to the listening log update for April of 2023. I'm going to be talking about 10 new albums that I spun over the last month. There's time codes listed in the description for if you want to skip around the video. Give it a like if you're excited, and let's go ahead and dive on in. Now, while I've never listened to anything M83's done outside of Hurry Up We're Dreaming, I still think that album is incredible, holds up tenfold. And that's not an uncommon opinion. It's heralded as a long-standing indie classic. And while I've been kind of loosely following them as far as like seeing what they've been dropping and seeing its reception, I haven't done another excursion into their work outside of today's subject, Fantasy, which is where I started this month. And I'm gonna be honest, if we're talking about checking in on a band and being happy with what you're seeing, Fantasy is kind of like the embodiment of that. This is another well-rounded batch of really lush, well-produced, synth-driven jams that channels some really nice, funky pockets throughout its runtime that I was really happy to see. I enjoy the euphoric splashes that happen throughout the drops throughout these tracks. You know, Deceiver has this pocket that it rides in, but once the vocals come back in, it brings me that same rush that happened on pockets of Hurry Up We're Dreaming. The same could be said for tracks like Amnesia and Earth to Sea. They really know how to capture that rush amidst a swell so fantastically, but I like that they also don't lose sight of a good, just pretty hook. Tracks like Ocean's Niagara and the title track are indicative of that tenfold. Fantasy actually reminds me of a different album that I'll be talking about from later on this month as well, as far as like paying tribute to a throwback sound and really tapping into that energy very, very well. I also just love how tight they sound as a unit still, like on tracks like Sunny Boy and Amnesia. And I gotta tell you, this thing is just gorgeous through and through. Us and the Rest is another really low-key moment that I love the vocals on. I love how they just soar over the ambience so beautifully. While I think the last stretch of the record may be the most drawn-out portion of it, I mean, Cool It into an interlude into another longer Dismemberment Bureau is a bit of a stretch, but I feel like even amidst that, especially with the closer Dismemberment Bureau, they find a way to still close the album on the same kind of strengths as far as like having this just lush, beautiful, spacious, airy track amicably. And as far as making an album that I think is maybe not as strong tenfold as the classic Hurry Up We're Dreaming, it's still a fantastic album that I feel like if you've enjoyed that album or enjoy, you know, the same psychedelic-infused, synth-driven stuff, that's definitely still a big part of pockets of the indie scene. You'll probably like pockets of Fantasy. I certainly did. A lot more than I honestly thought I would, but I can't put this thing down. I think that it's a really, really strong album, in my opinion, that makes me curious to see what I've missed out between now and then, but given the reception, I don't know if I'd like all of it nearly as much as I do this. But this is still getting an 8. This is a strong-ass record that I was happy to start my month off with. Now, between My Chem and Paramore dropping bangers, and upon the breakup of Panic at the Disco, Fall Out Boy releasing new music, I was excited at the potential for more 2000s nostalgia in a realm of where my nostalgia would be tapped into. You know, I like early Fall Out Boy, and Love from the Other Side felt more akin to where they left us. It felt very indicative of Folie à Deux and less like Mania, which the farther we get away from that record, the better. However, upon the release of So Much for Stardust, I was reminded why I don't wholly love Folie à Deux as a Fall Out Boy record, because while this definitely hits that same stride, especially when melding the more theatrical approach, especially when the songwriting is ramped up to infinity, like on like on Love from the Other Side, as seen on tracks like Heaven Iowa, which has this huge anthemic chorus that is of the same vein of what I heard on like American Beauty, American Psycho, but funneled more through what I expect from Fall Out Boy. The same grand theatricality hit on tracks like I Am My Own Muse. I'm reminded that with that comes fluff that I don't necessarily holistically enjoy. And while I would say this is still leaps and bounds above Mania, I like it about as much as I've liked a majority of Fall Out Boy's return. It doesn't quite hit the same highs that I was hoping it would, especially given how sharp Love from the Other Side was. And while I enjoy some of those other highs that I had already mentioned, and tracks like the Kitsugi Kid 10 Years feeling like this really, really good embodiment of a band that's been around for this long writing sort of reflective stuff, and it has a hook that just shakes the rafters. And I think that Fake Out channels another sort of pocket of more subdued throttling that Kitsugi Kid channels. This album's weak points come in that aforementioned fluff. You know, the interlude tracks of The Pink Seashell and Baby Annihilation just create these ambient, ambiguous tracks that feel like filler in the worst way. Some of the songwriting doesn't quite hit those same highs while trying to retain those big ideas. Like Hold Me Like a Grudge feels like a Fall Out Boy-ass title, but I just don't think the band executes it as well as they have in the past. While I appreciate them tapping into funk ideas like on So Good Right Now and What a Time to Be Alive, I don't think that those moments are quite as good as the other bombast or leaner cuts on here. This album ends up being a mixed bag in a way that I was hoping it wasn't going to be, but I'll still take all of over the lows that they've dropped throughout the 2010s, especially Mania, for all the problems I had with this. It's weird, while every time I listen to a new Fall Out Boy record, I go in hoping I enjoy it more than I end up doing so, that initial hype is what keeps me coming back every single time, along with those immaculate singles and EPs they drop in the interim. If they could just do a Paxam and a full length, I'd be happy. But so much for Stardust. For a while, it seemed like a true return to form, ends up fumbling in a few choice instances. I still think that this project still isn't the worst thing they've dropped, and it leaves me feeling somewhere in the middle. I'm going to give this a 5. It's not awful, but I've certainly seen this band keep it more consistent more often. Now, my evolved opinion, or the evolution of my opinion on Bay Area metal icons Metallica has been pretty well documented on the internet. When I had first started this channel and I was younger, they were like my favorite band ever because they were a band that I grew up listening to. Their 80s catalog is like embedded in the deep recesses of my brain, everything up through the Black Album anyway. And while I can appreciate that in their twilight years, they're learning to readapt and find better ways, or at least more interesting ways to pace their albums. I hate that they're taking cues from some of their icons in the vein of Iron Maiden by writing these longer, I would argue a little more tedious records out of their last two releases, Hardwired and this new one, 72 Seasons, because while Metallica are changing their album construction and sequencing style, they aren't changing that much to their songwriting and song composition to make it worth all of this investment. In fact, one of the things I would say that holds this album back as a whole is that they're still not really utilizing their talents in the best of ways. And I know it's because Metallica's gonna Metallica. You're still gonna have Lars's drums be what they are. You're still gonna have James's limited range not expanded on all that much. Although I will say, especially on the lead single of this Lux Eterna, they are showcasing some smaller evolutions that do crop up on the track Too Far Gone. But this album, by and large, is Metallica by numbers, with the exception of the fact that there's not really much ballad play, which I would argue was the biggest spice up and variety that Metallica was throwing into their whole album styling, you know? While, yes, Kurt can still shred, while, yes, Rob does get to have some bass work shine up a little more, especially on the track Sleepwalk My Life Away, which I was happy to see, I still feel like they are underutilizing Rob Trujillo as a bassist. He's an incredible bassist, and while I think he could do more to adapt the more thrash side of thrash that you saw in bands like Voivod and Slayer to some degree, he's kind of stuck in just playing in Metallica. And I feel like the older that I get, the more that I just kind of feel a little let down. Because, like, yeah, these guys were definitely the definition of knowing their strengths and playing to them. But in this time where they could continue to do weird shit, you know, while Lulu, I would argue, is a big face plant, they're still defending that record. So why not just lean into that and do weirder shit? I don't know. 72 Seasons feels like an album that does the smallest amount to change with hopes to getting the biggest reward back. And I just don't think it's worth that. If you like Metallica, you'll probably like a lot of what this album has going on. You know, while I think a lot of the longer songs on here, like Shadows Fall and Chasing Light, do nothing to really evolve much across their track listing. I'll give it to the closer, Inamorata, for at least having this evolution across its 11-minute runtime that feels indicative more out of what Metallica was doing, at least in their golden age, more prolifically. I wish I liked this album more. I wish it was a project. Also, I realized I probably could have put a Metallica album in the backdrop. Regardless, this Metallica album, 72 Seasons, I wish was a little more interesting. But for what it does Metallica to the most Metallica. I like it maybe a little bit less than their last album, Hardwired, if only because for it being a bit of a longer experience, it doesn't quite have the same adaptations and sort of reinterpretations of more of their material into something new, and feels more like the safest album for them to release in their twilight years. It's getting a 5. It's not awful, but it's surely a far cry from anything I would call like a modern classic.
And now you're going under.
I wouldn't say I'm the biggest Enter Shikari fan, but I think that when they do their brand of bombastic music well, it resonates with me whole stop. I think their last 2 albums were a great evolution of their sound that saw them harnessing the potential that their energy could channel and letting it just shake planets. And while A Kiss for the Whole World definitely tries to hit a same stride as far as keeping that bombast on 10, and in fact enhancing it in some regards by adding stuff like more horns, like on the opener, the title track, like the 1-2 punch of Please Set Me on Fire and It Hurts, which have these great vocal layering and some good meldings of great riff work and incredible chorus work, or Bloodshot, or Giant Pacific Octopus, I Don't Know You, while also finding ways to weave in their own typical Enter Shikari electronic-infused sound, pretty amicably like on Jailbreak. I feel like where this album falters is, one, there's some weak pockets on here. There's some tracks that I don't feel like interpolate their own ideas all that freshly, like on Feed Your Soul or Leap Into the Lightning. I also think that similarly to, ironically enough, the Fall Out Boy record, a lot of the interlude stuff on here just feels like fluff in the worst way possible. I can appreciate them trying to have this more scattershot ideals to album construction. I just think that without enough of certain attributes to help keep those ideas as a constant and more just kind of like a flash in the pan idea, leaves this album feeling all the more spread too thin. I like this album well enough, and similarly, again, to So Much for Stardust, I don't think it's the worst thing the band's done, but I feel like comparatively to their last couple of releases, I would say this is the weakest one I've spun so far. It's still not bad. It's still got some great stretches, and I could see people liking a lot more of what this album's got going on in pockets more than me. If you like Alexander Shikari's collective discography, but as somebody who doesn't like everything they've done, full stop, I definitely think this is a step in the wrong direction. I'd love to see them take some of these ideas and at least make them more of a recurring thing across an album, or at least not spread itself a little too thin. For an album that's only 33 minutes, it breezes through its runtime in the worst way possible. It's definitely got some highlights, but it's definitely leaving me feeling a little bit underwhelmed. It's still solid though. I'm giving it a 6. It's just an album that I kind of wish had more going on to keep me coming back for it as a holistic experience. And for something this short, that's kind of upsetting to say.
Something about the clutch of the wrist. He thought.
I'll be honest, my distance as far as appreciation for Lana Del Rey's discography by and large is what keeps me on the fences when it comes to diving into a new project. While I didn't check out Blue Banisters, I have enjoyed Chemtrails and Norman Rockwell better than pockets of her earlier work that really turned me off initially. And I'll be honest, part of the reason I end up checking out some Lana records is some of the splits and differences of opinion. You know, when it's a resounding L with the critical scene by and large, I'll give it a pass, because I know what I don't like out of Lana Del Rey's music, and I know what I do. And while I think that Did You Know There's a Tunnel Under Ocean Boulevard definitely has both, when it does tap into what I like about Lana Del Rey, it's fucking choice. You know, for all the highs that I enjoy, like the opener of the Grants, at creating this stage-setting swell that feels like it ties into the album's core of self-confidence and boosting well, along with having tracks like A&W and Margaret with the bleachers and Let the Light In sort of act as enhancements of that and pivots into analyzations of other realms with some great collaborations, I might add. I like her and Father John Misty. I feel like the two of them feel like they're kind of cut from similar cloths as songwriters to some degree. I think that they work really well together there, and the Bleachers collab does a good job at maintaining and carrying that sort of looseness that parts of this album has going on very decently. I feel like the album's real problems lie in where I felt like parts of Chemtrails Over the Country Club were, and the fact that she may have some good ideas, but they may just stretch out for a bit too long without too much to really keep me invested as a listener. You know, while I love the sounds of Kintsugi, and I love tying into the themes of Kintsugi into bettering yourself and using that as a really good analytical or allegorical writing, and having that as a good metaphor throughout the song, I just think it just goes on for a bit too long. I also think that there's some tracks where I feel like her songwriting has that same clumsiness in pockets that I haven't liked from parts of her earlier past work. You know, tracks like Sweet, and even the title track. I feel like those are two really clumsily written tracks that try to hit those same Lana-isms that she's done in the past, but just do it in a very tired fashion, in my opinion. I actually could really care less about the interludes by and large. While I think the John Batiste one works after Candy Necklace to some degree, that's another track that I just think is not one of the stronger ones on here. Its metaphor writing isn't quite as strong as on a track like Kintsugi. I don't know. I'm of two minds with this record. It has moments that I think Lana does well and exceeds in bringing out what I've enjoyed from records of hers that I've liked, while having clear, glaring points that take me out of the experience or just highlight what I don't like about Lana Del Rey as a songwriter at the end of the day. I don't know. This album's fine. I like it about as much as Chemtrails Over the Country Club, even if I think that there aren't quite as many moments on there as on here that I think reflect the negative attributes of Lana Del Rey's songwriting as a whole. I'm giving it a 6, though. It's very solid. It's just not quite as good, in my opinion, as I've seen it held up to in pockets of the internet. Lucy Dacus, Julian Baker, Phoebe Bridgers, boygenius, indie supergroup whose debut album, after some splashings of hype throughout the last couple of years, culminating to this, a project that is about unity, a project that is about showcasing all of their proverbial strengths apart and finding a way to make them all meld together. Tracks that feature the same personal touches all three of them can channel on their own while finding ways to harmonize amidst all of that. You know, and that's all capped off from jump with Without You, Without Them, which is just an a cappella track showing the three of them almost fusing together in a three-way sort of like fusion dance via Dragon Ball Z. I love all three of their voices together on that track, and I like how immediately from there it sort of trickles off into their own tangents, whether it's tracks like Emily, I'm Sorry, which feel a lot more personal, given it's a Phoebe Bridgers fronted track that seemingly talks about her breaking off from her polyamorous relationship into a much more intimate one-on-one monogamous relationship, which I feel like kind of transitions even well into True Blue, which to showcase an example of that unity amidst their own solo excursions lyrically. True Blue, a Lucy-fronted song, sort of talks about splitting away and talking about your path pillaging onward. You know, there's this sort of weaving it out of unity and the focusing of unity throughout this project that I think helps unify the three of their songwriting styles together beautifully. On top of the fact that they're all just really talented artists that I think all kind of feel like they're of the same ilk as far as their stylistic choices are considered, and that's what makes them all the more better together as this sort of indie cocktail. And a lot of that intimacy and love, or at least delvings into one's own personal excursions, kind of feels like a follow-through throughout a lot of this, whether it's deconstructing one's own internal conflicts, like on Not Strong Enough, or breaking from your own roots in your own way, like on Satanist. A lot of this album, by and large, I think is just incredibly well penned, but on top of that, the musicianship as well is just so fucking tight. I like the more indie rock leaning stuff like $20 and Satanist, but I enjoy that they also kind of meld that with that same sort of intimate pain or that intimate prettiness seen on like Phoebe Bridgers' Punisher, who is the only artist that I really have a lot of familiarity with out of the three. I kind of feel out of touch with some components of this when talking about Lucy Dacus and Julian Baker, because I'm aware of who they are, but I haven't really had much exposure to their own proverbial stuff like I have Phoebe's. And I think that same acoustic intimacy shines well on Revolution Zero. This is just a really tight indie record that I think checks a lot of the boxes that I look for in a good singer-songwriter project. It's just sort of also has the accented greatness of being this great showcasing of three singer-songwriters writing not only apart but unifying their own ideas together so incredibly well. You know, they talked about going to like Thralpo counseling when making this, and I feel like that helped unify them even further. I think this is a strong-ass album. I know that it's gotten a lot of praise throughout pockets of the internet, but I feel like it's deservedly so. These three are incredible songwriters, and I think that they work incredibly well together. I think their vocal harmonies are fucking top-notch. I think that the moments where they kind of trade off vocals like on $20 kind of helps enhance those feelings and thematics of unity all the more so, and I think this is a strong album. Easily album of the year contender. I think it's fucking aces, and I feel like if you enjoy indie singer-songwriter stuff, or if you liked any three of these particular artists' solo ventures, listen to this, because I think they all work incredibly well together.
It's 5 p.m. on Sunday. No one knows we're dancing.
I'll be honest, I would have had no interest in this group by and large if it weren't for Todd and the Shadows' video on their one hit from the 90s, Missing. Not to say that they're not a talented duo, they just were a band that kind of fizzled out as I was really getting more into music. I mean, their prominence was in the mid-90s, and I was only like 3 years old. And while their 80s stuff is very, very good, and their album that has Missing on Amplified Heart is pretty fucking great, they just weren't a band that I really followed all that closely. But this album, their comeback album, their first album in at least 21 years, Fuse, gave me the same sort of pseudo-nostalgia that spinning the last Deep Forest album gave me back in 2016, which I know is another 90s as fuck deep cut, but parts of Fuse really feel indicative of that same, like, sticking to your guns, knowing what you know style that I think this group has always kind of been good at pulling together. You know, their discography is kind of this slow evolution. And while parts of this surely do sound very indicative of that mid-90s electronic scene in pockets, stuff like the opener, Nothing Left to Lose, Caution to the Wind, No One Knows We're Dancing, and even the more lower-key electronic atmosphere, Karaoke, the closer, feels indicative of where they kind of left us. And I kind of like that about it. You know, I think that it's very, very low-key and mellow, very similarly to that Deep Forest album, but in a very different lane. What I like about this over a project like that is that they find a way to let that same sadness and sort of pain ring out still so strongly. You know, there's a sense of vulnerability to pockets of this album lyrically that retain that same intimacy that they had channeled throughout their more prolific era that I think doesn't feel lost at all. You know, tracks like Run a Red Light and Lost and When You Mess Up describe these feelings of one's own insecurities, one's own feelings of directionlessness very well. And I feel like the sparse soundscapes help accent a lot of those feelings of vulnerability. Tracks like Time and Time Again and Interior Space, while the latter tries to almost tap into also a pseudo-Imogen Heap style, I just don't think are as strong as some of the more kinetic or lower key sparse tracks like I had mentioned, like the closer. But still, this album, by the by, while playing very nostalgic in some instances, was a nice showcasing of these guys coming back and writing some really, really strong tunes, in my opinion, while keeping a good thematic follow-through, at least tonally. I could see people not liking this for thinking that it's a bit too sparse or a bit too loose, but I can appreciate a lot of the songwriting on display here. And again, I like that sound that they're channeling on here. It's very much low-key and throwback in a lot of sense, but as somebody who likes low-key music with a throwback style, it definitely strikes a lot of notes that I enjoy. And while I'm not sure if this will lead to much for these two, I at least appreciate seeing them come back and write a solid record all their own. I'm giving this a 7. It's really not bad. It's got a lot of really decent ideas and some pretty solid attempts at recapturing an idea that has been lost for so long. And I feel like if you enjoy that sort of intimate feeling, almost dance atmosphere, you should give some of this a spin, because I think it's got some strong stuff.
I'll be the border.
Now, I'll be honest, while I like Depeche Mode's classics, anything post their classics I'm not really familiar with. I know that they've been pretty consistent as a group, and even in the wake of the passing of Andy Fletcher, they're still dropping music. Case in point, their newest Memento Mori, the first as a duo. I wasn't necessarily counting it out, because their classics are that strong, and they're a band whose influence is undeniable. And I feel like if the band were keeping it that consistent, they hadn't really lost it, as it were, in my opinion. I feel like on Memento Mori, that does nothing but to enhance that aspect of my argument. You know, I think that this is a strong-ass album, especially given it's in the wake of a passing of a crucial member of the band. It's also an album released in the twilight years of a band, and I feel like with the idea of grief definitely on the minds of the group, see one of the singles to this, Ghosts Again, which is a very great cut. I think that they further explore those ideas of emotional distress and turmoil amidst grief, while pulling together some incredibly tight synth-driven jams that further showcase why they are legends in the craft. You know, tracks like Wagging Tongue with its sleek groove and Caroline's Monkey, which chorus feels very indicative similarly of the themes from Ghosts Again. You know, Soul With Me sees them adding a bit of soul and lushness to that cold synthesis to have more of a strong resonance to those themes as well. This album definitely has a mission statement thematically it's trying to present. While I think there's a couple of tracks where maybe some of the sonic components maybe clash a bit too heavily, or just the songs as a whole don't quite net the same positivity as some of the highs. And even in some instances, the production themselves kind of kneecaps the tracks themselves. I like My Favorite Stranger, but I hate the lead synth production on the track. And I feel like it juxtaposed with some of the more reverb-soaked synthetic textures creates a sound that doesn't quite work for me. The same could be said with the track Always You, which I enjoy the build-up throughout the instrumental, and I love the lushness and, again, that reverb atmosphere that the track has going on. I feel like that track should be done a little more intimately, in my opinion. But even in that breath, there are some tracks where it feels like they're definitely incorporating where they may have influenced more into the sound, into their own sounds, like Before We Drown, which I think is a great track to come after the really kinetically driven Caroline's Monkey that feels like vintage Depeche Mode. I love Before We Drown, and I love the build-up throughout that track. It feels like their interpretation of like a How to Destroy Angels track, and I love the real sadness explored on that track. As somebody who, again, knows this group, but has lost touch with a lot of their newer stuff, I liked checking in and seeing that these guys, especially in the wake of tying that loss into their music so heavy-handedly, executed it pretty well on a damn fine record, in my opinion. I like this thing a lot. I think that it's really good, and while I think some of that overproduction kneecaps some of the great songs on here, the songs themselves are still pretty good, and kept me coming back for more. I don't know, I like this thing a lot. I'm giving it an 8. I think that it's a really, really strong outing from these guys. And I'm glad to see a legacy act still make some bangers in their twilight years.
Help me make the most of freedom.
Jazzwave's Copy Wrong was another mashup album I found in the dirges of the Guitar Hero community. And their follow-up, Squaring the Circle, is something that I was morbidly curious about, because I really like Jazzwave. It had actually one of my favorite songs of the year on it, and I was curious to see how they would interpolate other ideas ironically into morphing song ideas into a different funnel. And while I feel like there's definitely showcases of that on here, there are a couple instances where I feel like either the album is too caught up in its concept for like an ironic mashup album, and also just kind of throws in some ideas that kneecap some of the better ideas, in my opinion. You know, while I think it starts off really good with Grand Theft Technology and blues stuff, I think that those meldings of electronic ideas, like Blvd with ghosts and stuff, fucking genius. And the idea of Grand Theft Technology using techno logic, especially with the copy-paste portion in the track, it just felt like a really good point that was really, really hilarious. And I think Capitol Hill is fan-fucking-tastic at bringing together Party in the USA with Beverly Hills by Weezer. Tracks like Basket Man, which is a melding of Basket Case and Superman, which would have been great all their own, decides to throw Chop Suey in there in a way that I don't think quite meshes with the ideas that track has going on. Maybe I'm lost on it, maybe it's something that goes way over my head, and I could be wrong. But then there are also tracks that I kind of wish just had a little more going on, like Giving Pressure. It's a track that I think is genius, but was just cut way too fucking short. And there's other genius in the form of Reminder Wall, which brings How You Remind Me and Wonderwall together in demonic harmony. I Just Want to Rule the World is Iris with Everybody Wants to Rule the World, and it's, again, just that perfect harmony that I think works really, really well. It's just an album that feels caught up in its concept maybe a little too much. A lot of the interlude mashups I feel like are to service this idea of squaring the circle, and with other mashups that I don't think are as strong as others, like Walk in 2 and Lose Your Complications. I still think this is a pretty solid mashup album, and the points that it's hilarious keep me wanting to come back, and I feel like while there isn't necessarily anything as strong in here as Manic from Copy Wrong, I think that if we're talking like straightforward mashups, it's got some cool ideas, some good flippings of
original song ideas. It's got some of that to some degree, but it definitely feels lost a little bit, in my opinion, comparatively so. But it's still not bad. Still mad solid. Still getting a 7 because its highs really are that fucking hilarious to me. Now, I'm still relatively new to a lot of Xiu Xiu's discography by and large. Their original material pre-Girl with a Basket of Fruit is still kind of a mystery to me. I didn't really like Oh No all that much, but I like that on Ignore Grief, they pull themselves back into the darkness and more unsettling ideas that I really enjoyed from the stuff of them that I'd heard, and what made me feel like they were a perfect fit to adapt the Twin Peaks soundtrack. You know, from jump on the Real Chaos Cha-Cha-Cha, you get this idea of how unnerving this experience is going to be with these harsh sounds juxtaposed with these whirling off-kilter synth ideas with some spoken word meddled in the mix. A follow-through that kind of permeates around a lot of this album. You know, you've got dissonant chords ringing out throughout this thing, with some sprinkles of what I would argue are a foundation to grab onto in the form of the kinetic tracks, like Escarita Little Richard, which has this chopped up sound to kind of propel the listener, or Border Factory with its sort of chords acting as a foundation and a groove to hook the listener. All the while they experiment with these juxtapositions of cold, empty ambience with these sharp, almost horror-style stings in the form of string descending and haunting chords and choruses, like on Tarsier, 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 and Dracula Parrot, Moonmoth. While lyrically they explore the ideas of trauma and abuse and the reflections of that with tracks like Maybe Baby and Parump, which see them going to these morbid, dark, cryptic places. And the spoken word style delivery on these tracks helps lend to that unnerving atmosphere tenfold with the subject matter at hand. This is one of those albums that I know isn't going to be for everybody because it is very bold and out there, and there's some nice experimentations that go on sonically. But as somebody who likes a lot of that stuff and likes when Xiu Xiu gets dark, I think that this taps into that same darkness all the well, and I would say that this is, I wouldn't say as strong as A Girl with a Basket of Fruit or the Twin Peaks stuff as far as really going full stop, but I feel like it gets closer to what I really liked about those releases more so than Oh No. I feel like some of the sparseness and ambience and some of the ambiguity, unlike on A Girl with a Basket of Fruit, doesn't give the album as much weight as that, but I still think it's really strong, and I still think it's, out of the stuff I've spun this year, still one of the best things I've heard all year. I'm giving it an 8. I think that it's still an incredibly bold album through and through, and I like that they focus more on creating this haunting memory to last with the listener that ties it well into the themes, in my opinion. And that's what I spun this month. If you liked any of these records, or if there's anything I missed that you want me to cover in future installments, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. If you did like this video, be sure to give it a like. If you want to see more, consider subscribing. I drop 2 to 4 vids a week, depending on what I got going on. But either way, I'm going to go. Thank you again so very much for watching. I've been Viral Rack. You guys have a good day's lives and situations, and I'll see you another day.